All right, it's 1 o'clock, so we're right on track to get started. Thanks everybody for joining today during uh, people's afternoon, morning, and lunch. We're going to tell you the story about the Grinch today and all the fun threats. What's up, Jacob? All right, I'll get my mask off. Woo! Yeah, get a little bit more comfortable.
At
Can you
least
hear me all right?
Yeah, you've got the gloves though. Those are what matter.
I got to take those off too because it's hard to use a mouse. And I think I have a different camera, and then everyone can see my newest addition to my skateboard collection. I got a bunch of new ones today, so this one's actually one of my favorites, and I think respective of a lot of people in the security industry. I mean, who doesn't like Dennis the Menace? So that's one of my favorite classic comics, and I don't know, kind of exciting.
Anyone who watches these webinars weekly, Patrick, can just see your skateboard collection grow by the week.
Yeah, this is probably like a quarter of it right now. At home, I bring them to my office so that they're not at home, because then I get comments from other people, which is pretty funny. So thanks everybody for hopping on. Have a bunch of people on today, which is great. Hey Brian, Chase, Forrest, Patrick, Dean. It's great to have everybody here. We're going to be talking about assessing threat detection and response. And I have Jacob Julian with me. A little bit of context. Jacob is a sales engineer, solutions engineer, all sorts of experience in engineering. And you've worked with a lot of customers on security projects over many years, right?
Oh yeah, you could say that, Patrick. I mean, prior to coming to Blumira, I worked at Duo Security, Cisco, whatever you want to call it these days, and I was there for 5 years, working on MFA and all sorts of other implementations.
Yep. No, and I was at Duo as well, so we got to work together previously, and yeah, a lot of times implementing security controls, get them into place, and so it's interesting to come from that angle of like, hey, two-factor prevents everything. I'm kind of joking there, but in regards to the seeing the other side of the picture, which is what you can actually gain visibility, how to detect threats or potential threats or suspected threats, and then actually be able to take some form of action on them, coming to Blumira. So yeah, it's fun experience just seeing different sides of the coin as it relates to security. And one of the things we're going to be talking about today is kind of approach to how to assess detection capabilities. And what we find working with customers, and sorry, my espresso machine is working as I'm talking. Sorry for the background noise. But yeah, kind of what we run through and see from a perspective of customers. And I think, working in the security industry for a long time, Jacob, I think we see a lot of perspectives of different practices people are doing or different practices people aren't doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious to hear your perspective of what you typically see when you're looking at, and talking with different customers as far as what they're doing as it relates to threat detection and response.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it depends on the size of the organization, right? You see varying levels of capabilities for a smaller shop that might just be a single IT manager for 100 people than you do for a 2,000 user technology focused company. In general, I would say that a lot of people lack even basic centralized logging, though, right? They might have logs that are being retained from disparate systems, but a lot of the time they don't have centralized logging to even start with threat detection. And if they do have the logging, they might not necessarily even be doing any sort of analysis on it. It might just be, kept on a SAN or an NAS somewhere and stored for a year, and nobody even looks at the logs. So I think the bar for improvement is, pretty low. I think when we look at what most organizations are doing, it's surprisingly little, and a lot of the time only done to check boxes for compliance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're, completely right, which is like varying levels of detection capabilities in place, right? And I know, logging in centralized, more or less rural threat detection is one piece of that, right? And I think there's other aspects as well, as far as controls in place around detection and prevention too. Things like endpoint detection and response, EDR, in some cases antivirus, right? Depending on what people are using within those environments or both. And then you have prevention capabilities also in places like your firewall. Um, a lot of times that are detecting threats and stopping them kind of at the forefront of it, right? But kind of curious to hear your insight into like there's still a lot of different ways in, even though that firewall is preventing
Yeah,
a large majority of the threats as it's intended to do, right?
I think that's the goal, right? Is that the hope is that it's doing that, right? But a lot of that depends on who configured it, who's continually managing it, who's updating it, and a lot of the times those are activities that aren't necessarily maintained to the degree they should be. But even outside of that, there's a lot of activities that maybe aren't necessarily happening within the scope of your workstations that have a next gen AV, or within the scope of your firewall, right? Especially as we say, the perimeter is identity now, right, Patrick? What are you doing for your cloud-based applications? What are you doing for your AWS workloads? What does that security look like? So I think that there's a lot of gaps in coverage when it comes to threat detection and actually blocking bad things happening. And a lot of people, you don't know what you don't know, right? So it's
No, and
very
I think
reactive.
that's I think that's a pretty big reality. And I think also like two-factor is extremely effective, right? We worked for
Yep.
Duo. It works really well, but the reality is like out of most of the deployments that we saw, people didn't implement it everywhere.
Yeah, or you didn't
Um,
find it for everyone, right?
yes, and so that even is one aspect of the the area of like, well, you might think you have the right controls in place, but maybe not to the depth or extent that you actually need to have them in place. Or maybe that control doesn't work via a certain avenue, like a different protocol, for instance, right?
Yeah.
Or an API type connection. So um, yeah, it is a really interesting aspect to kind of take a look at. Hey, well, what are actually some of the different threats, right, that are commonly getting within customers' environment, and how can we essentially prevent them from happening? Is really more or less the goal. Um, so curious, like some of the different threats that we continue to see. What are some of the ones on your mind that come up time and time again with customers?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it's right misconfigurations on the firewall. So, hey, I didn't know I had that RDP open to the internet. I didn't know that I had an SMB share that somebody could, it was publicly accessible, or FTP port open, right? Those are some pretty big ones that come up pretty frequently, and they're largely the aspect of misconfiguration, or let me just open this for testing, and then you never go back and you never revisit it. Um, those are some large ones. I also see, right? I mean, brute forcing and password spraying is not going to stop. It's probably more active than it ever has been, and we do know that multi-factor is a good mitigating control for that. But like you mentioned, it's not always on every application or every attack surface or every user, or maybe those users that are in it you might be in bypass temporarily, right? I mean, all it takes is one person. But those are some of the more common areas I think that we tend to see guaranteed in some environments.
Yeah, or even like I think in some instances, hey, primary authentication is compromised. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, you still have that second factor, but it doesn't have the full extent of trust of two-factor, right?
Yeah.
So it makes it easier for someone to try and get in. One of the things I have up on the screen right now is something that I've been at Blumira almost a year now, But time and time again, the reason why I created this more or less is because it was kind of shocking that people didn't even realize what they weren't doing or what they didn't have. And a little bit of context here is, being in coming more on the blue team defensive side detection company, which is new to me as of a year ago. I'd say relatively speaking, I've been in the security industry for a long time, but like it's been duo two-factor access security prevention, right? What was really interesting is seeing a stack of pen tests and going through that stack of pen tests, and the reality was like maybe like 75% of those penetration tests showed that customers lack the capability to detect much of anything. And maybe some of it got prevented by a firewall or by two-factor, but ultimately the organization ended up on the pen test in a situation where they were owned, right? Through multiple different avenues. And so, yeah, I started talking to a lot of prospective customers and people, and there wasn't even a base understanding of what things should I be doing from a threat detection perspective, or what should I assess. And so some of them, I will be transparent and clear. Some of this is like the reality of educating people on basic things that they should make sure they have in place.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other side of it is like, oh, it helps us sell stuff too. But in reality, I think like we, with this assessment guide that we created, it provides a pretty good, and no sacred cause, you can totally make fun of me on the call for the comment on trying to sell stuff, right? But people need to justify why they need some, or they don't even know they need it, right? Is the reality. And so it's really easy binary with something like two-factor authentication of firewall. Like nobody's not going to have a firewall in place. But I think when you get into detection response, there's so many things that you could do. And to be honest, the firewall does some of that. Endpoint detection does some of that. A SIM does some of that, right? That it became important to make sure, like, hey, let's talk about the things you're doing to even get an understanding if you're going to have a chance when someone tries to come and attack you. In essentially like high level report, I'll dig into the details in a second. Most of the time when we're talking to a small to medium sized business, the reality of detection capabilities before, when we're talking with them is a good portion of organizations have little to no centralized logging. And I'll dig into the details there, right? In a lot of that has to do with accessibility of things like centralized logging, SIM, and the complexity associated with it, right? And why they're not doing that today is like it's either extremely complicated to be able to do that, or it's not. It's cost prohibitive, if that's helpful. And then looking at the area of like, hey, what area should I be looking at from a threat detection perspective? We'll hop into that a little bit in a second in details. How am I getting alerting? Like most people are like, yeah, my firewall sends off a ton of alerts and a ton of information. Like I don't have time to look at it. Or Windows logs, like, yeah, I don't look at anything. It's an event viewer, those sorts of situations. So, more or less quickly, I tend to like to run through and talk through how we go from, something like an environment that has very little known coverage, and I'll hop through what those are, to a place where customers have a good sense of they're going to catch someone without a lot of work if they're if they're under attack in some level of the cybersecurity kill chain or a stage attack, if that's helpful. So, all right, Jacob. Ideally, the idea is to get them to a better state where they actually do have visibility into, what attacks are coming at them, what people are trying and attempting, and some aspect of trying to help them stop. And so, very aligned with what we're doing from a Blumira perspective, and helping them. So curious what you see too. It's like, hey, when people do have a solution in place, like, have you kind of seen how they stack up when we're hopping into like a assessment to see if they truly get to an end state where they're pretty well covered?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of it comes down to how well the solution has been maintained today, and right, how many people are managing it. And a lot of the time you can get, you can check most of these boxes, or more of these boxes than zero, right? But are you actually getting any value out of that is the next question. So, right, do you have someone who is able to get valuable data out of the logs if you are collecting logs? Right, that's the next question. Then are you doing anything with it? Is the next step from that. But also, I mean, when we've worked with people, Patrick, right, they might have logging, and they might be using, right, even take your big name SIMs out there. They might have centralized logging for a good portion of applications, but still missing maybe cloud applications. If they're doing like syslog forwarding to that SIM, they might not be hooking into 365 and centralizing logs from that, which is a huge blind spot when it comes to correlating events if something did happen. That's a big gap that I think we've seen more often than not, is a partial deployment of a SIM or a logging tool that doesn't give you insight into necessarily everything you have.
Yeah, and I agree 100%, right? Whereas in a lot of times that could be compliance driven, or it's like, yeah, I'll look back at it when there's an incident or there is a real
Yeah.
problem, right?
Well, and there's value to
Um,
that, right? Being able to piece together historically, but it's not proactive value. It doesn't help you in real time.
yep. So some of the things we have on here, and there is a download a PDF similar to this, right? But yeah, the first things I just look at are, hey, are you actually centralizing security audit logs in some way? Often the answer is no, right? Should I be doing that? Or they know they should be doing it, but like they just haven't got around to the project because they know it's essentially a large project with most tools, which basically answers all the rest of the questions, right? Which is, are you retaining all of them for 365? Sometimes also they'll have partial coverage because they don't want to pay for licensing or storage,
Yeah.
things like that with the way things are licensed. But then I think we get down to things like, as we start getting into Windows, right? You have certain things you can actually enable to get better visibility, even from a logging perspective, that are going to change the way you can do threat detection as well, right? So, what are some of those things that come to mind as it relates to the Windows environments?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, from what we've seen, some of the most obvious audit settings and logging settings for Windows that you would expect to be enabled out of the box just are not. So a lot of the time you end up trying to search for maybe event IDs that haven't been enabled, and you don't know that they're not enabled until after you need them. And that could be related to, log on, log off events, account lockouts, things like that, that are, in some cases enabled already, but not always. The other thing I see is that people assume that if I'm monitoring logs from one domain controller, I'm covered on the rest because there's replication. But security events across domain controllers don't replicate. So you do need to be logging from each individual domain controller if you want to get a full view of what's happening in your environment. So, from our side, right? I mean, we developed the tool Logmira or Flowmira, one of those two.
Both
There's a
of
lot of,
them.
yeah, a lot, both of them. Yeah, yeah. And one is for Sysmon, I believe. But essentially, these are GPO backup templates that you can use to enable. I think there's like 60 or 70 different more verbose audit settings on your Windows hosts that aren't necessarily always enabled out of the box that you might think they would be. And so we developed that so that administrators can do that with as quickly as you can deploy a group policy, 10 minutes or so to deploy it to a test OU, if that, and give you, a whole level additional of insight into what's happening, much more verbose logging, so that you have the logs when you need them, not retroactively trying to piece together a partial picture.
Yep. No, and agree 100%. Like, getting all your servers to centralized logging, getting the audit capabilities enabled from a GPO perspective. Those are all baseline things. So actually you can even do investigation. And it also adds other value, like, hey, guess what? You can detect things like maybe a failed backup, failed disks, failed user logins, like
Yeah.
things that you're going to want to kind of analyze and look at from a hygiene perspective. Hop into the next thing right down, which is like, well, now I actually have some logs. If I'm talking about SIM, but like overall threat detection, it's like, I'll highlight the things that maybe you want to make in place that we don't do, right? Like two-factor phishing prevention, like a Umbrella, Open DNS, highly effective. Endpoint detection, like a Carbon Black, CrowdStrike, and we integrate with these products, by the way, from a Blumira perspective. But like, those are pretty, common understanding of maybe not as much the DNS phishing, but it's pretty common out there that you're doing some sort of like content filtering. But more or less getting to this point of like doing central monitoring and correlating threat intelligence, right? And then applying it in a way from a rule perspective so that you can actually effectively detect things really from anywhere in your environment, right?
Yeah. I mean, what I would say here, right, is that it's not just a matter of can we detect that an activity is happening? It's do we want to get alerted on this and does it make sense? And what behaviors can we correlate with these activities to determine if there actually is a true threat, right? I might not want to get alerted every time someone fails a login, but maybe if there's so many in a certain period of time, and that's happening across other users as well, right? That's indicative of a maybe a password spray or brute force a targeted attempt, something like that, right? Those are activities that I might want to get alerted on more so than just did it happen, but also what's the context around it, and what other things can we correlate with those attempts. That's where I think the beauty of a product like a SIM comes into play. When it's compared to these disparate products like an endpoint detection product, right? Or you mentioned Umbrella, which is incredibly useful for many different use cases. But being able to correlate across different products and really know in real time, is someone trying to enumerate objects across my network by doing network scanning, or are they exfiltrating data in large amounts over FTP to a port that, or to an IP that has been unseen before, right? Those are the values of having good threat detection in your environment. It's not just knowing that things are happening, it's knowing that relevant and timely things are happening.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting because like when people say ransomware, like how do I prevent it? Oh, I need to get EDR, CrowdStrike, Carbon
Yeah.
Black. Like that's a host level prevention. Like you're pretty much like last stage of an attack, which hey, that's good. You do need that. I'm not gonna say you don't, right? Or it's a way to contain it, right?
Yep.
But yeah, I think what's really interesting is like, well, normally a stage attack happens where there's password spraying, there's misconfigurations of open ports over RDP or SMB on the internet. Someone's trying to get an exploit access to a Windows host or a VPN or something other, and then from there they're going to take it and they're gonna go into like, hey, what other systems can I get access to? And so like, hey, getting detection down with honeypots so you detect lateral movement, even some
Yeah.
form of base within their network. So when someone goes and tries to start logging into things, they can detect that early and they can get them out of their network. And then from there, right, basically usually they go spin up domain accounts once they get access and deploy ransomware across the board. So yeah, that's, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, no, man, there's many other things you can do
Yeah.
that actually stop this much earlier. That being said, you should do both.
I always tell
Um,
people, Patrick, you don't want to know that your data is being, sold online when someone comes knocking on your door from law enforcement, right? You want to know, you want to know ahead of time that maybe, hey, a workstation reached out to a command and conquer server. You want to know that, hey, there's gigabytes of data that's being exfiltrated across the network, right? And that someone created domain admin accounts and other accounts to, leverage those credentials laterally across the network. There's many indicators before someone comes knocking on your door and says you've got data being sold.
hey, or I've had this one, right? the cops or the FBI does show up and says, hey, we noticed that you've been compromised, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's very real, right?
Hey, no, it is really real. I'll tell you a true story too. Hey, you've been compromised. Well, hey, we looked at our logs and we see no indication of what you're telling us, right?
Yeah.
Once we actually told the FBI that, they go, oh, sorry, we had the wrong IP address. So I mean, that's another aspect where it's like, yeah, it's
That's a
also
new
the
one.
ability
Yeah.
to know from an investigation perspective if something happened or not, right?
Yeah. I mean, you want to be able to either prove positively or negatively in those cases, right? Yeah. I mean,
Hey,
that's.
I also I want to emphasize everyone on the call, like we do have ability to chat in, chime in. If you have any comments on the threat side as far as things you should make sure you have from an assessment perspective from as it relates to detection and response, right? And we'll keep on moving on, but meant to be interactive, so please don't hesitate to hop in if there's anything you want to comment or have questions on. So, and then I think transitioning up a little bit. I need more. I should have got more water today, but I'll be okay.
You want to talk about alerting though?
Yeah, alerting.
Yeah.
Um,
What's the first thing you think of when you talk about alerting, Patrick? For me, it's alert fatigue. Right? If you have alerting at all.
Yeah, I think for most people it's noisy, right? So like
Yeah.
existing security products are known for just
spewing out.
ton of information and alerts. And I think a good example of this is I'm gonna drink first. I mixed like a little bit of coffee with a lot of water.
That sounds terrible.
But what is everyone else doing right now in my situation? It's really bad. But yeah, more or less, like I look at something like Cisco Umbrella. If all the alerting that comes out of Cisco Umbrella and the amount of noise, that product works well, right? It's effective at what it does. But most of the information they're telling you is like someone tried to click on a bad link. Big deal, right? Like users are going to do that. The tool did its job.
Yeah, they're individual events.
So it ends up creating a ton of noise and nobody looks at the product anymore and it does its job as intended. But there are things in there, right, specifically where if they're happening, you actually do want to look into it, like persistence. Something continually trying to click something over time, or hey, command and control. Like I would want to know about those things and go fix them.
Yeah.
But the reality is like across an environment with different security products, most of them make a ton of different noise.
Yep.
And it's hard to sort through what actually is important, what needs to be prioritized. And so you effectively as a good practice from a threat detection and response perspective, you need a centralized tool to help you prioritize those things, to eliminate most of the noise so it's not just continually battering you with information. And then there is an aspect of also notification outside of channels. So things like phone call and SMS.
Yeah.
Because like maybe actually the incident is with an email and it's compromised more or less, and that channel no longer works effectively, right?
One of the first things I would do if I was an attacker and compromised email, I'd create a new inbox rule to forward out all the email I don't want someone to see. Right? So I mean, hey, that's real.
Yeah,
that's a real thing that happens. But yeah, I mean, being able to get timely alerts, people get hundreds of emails a day, right? Thousands in some cases a week, right? Not everything needs to be an email. You want something a little bit more attention grabbing if it's serious.
And then I think there's the aspect of like, as it relates to threat detection and response, and I think compliance is a big factor because compliance drives these things. Now, some things I see time and time again, customers go is like, I just need to meet my compliance requirements. And the intent behind compliance is actually really so that you have the proper security controls. But there are a lot of people that will drive to compliance only, and that's it. and make decisions on that alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the important thing here to consider is audit and compliance there's a reason behind it. It's a good thing, but generally speaking, making sure you can get the reports you need from an audit perspective so you can prove you're actually doing something becomes particularly important. As much as you can schedule and automate that becomes great. Having offsite retention, and I mentioned this, like the concept of cloud, having your logs in the cloud is actually one that's a really good thing, because now I have a audit record that's offsite somewhere else that we can then go leverage and use if we need to investigate something
They're
going on.
tamper proof.
Yes, you don't want things to be tampered. So
yeah, that's incredible.
And then on the response side, right? As we're surfacing threats, it becomes more or less of knowing what to do and being able to do it quickly, right? And so the first thing we have to assume is that not everyone is a security expert, like you, Jacob.
No, you give me credit. Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, a lot of the places we work with, Patrick, right? I mean, they might have a security team, but it might be 1 or 2 people, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that person that's responding every single time to every single detection that's surfaced, right? That's not a good use of time. I was just talking to someone who said, I would just love to delegate this work to our operations team, because we have a backlog a mile long of security projects that we'd rather work on, rather than try and track down someone who created an inbox rule and determine if that's legitimate or not. And there's a lot of real value to that. And so having playbooks and having a response standard operating procedure for certain things that are happening in the environment is actually invaluable when it comes to pushing that work down to maybe operations from security, or even to I worked with someone who wanted to have their junior admin do investigation prior to the senior admin closing a ticket, right? Having guidance there is incredibly important, because a lot of people will suffer from analysis paralysis, right? There's too many options, there's too many things to do, so they just don't know what to do, and they don't do anything when they see something, which is not what you want to happen in a security event, but it is the reality. If you don't have any guidance, you will freeze in some cases, because you just don't know where to start, and that's a huge problem.
It's a hard problem, and like you need to be able to solve it in order to scale, more or less, right?
Yep. Exactly.
And then I think the other side of response is like, what can you do from an automated perspective? I think that like next gen firewall is an example, and we're always promoting. It's like if someone's not using the next gen firewall, it's like, hey, go and get one, because that's going to help you. I'll be the first person to recommend security products that aren't even our companies that people should have controls in place of, right? It's not any one vendor or one product that's a silver bullet. That's incredibly useful. The only silver bullet's Blumira. No, I'm joking. No, I think we've all learned that is like you can have every control in place, right? And there's always going to be risk, and there's always going to be gaps. The idea is to minimize that as much as possible. And so I think what's interesting is like next gen firewall, also the ability to and this is something Blumira actually does, is correlate threat feeds and block them automatically. And automatically block other threats as it relates to firewall or egress points, right? Because it's essentially going to limit your exposure to real risk.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases too, I think what I find is like things like, hey, you're a US company and you only do business in the US. Like, wouldn't you want to know when someone's logging in from outside the US? Wouldn't you want to know actually when someone's sharing a document externally if you're a small to mid-sized organization? In some cases, right, that might be normal behavior and frequent, so maybe you don't want to look at every single thing. But for most organizations, right, that's probably not a normal activity.
Yeah, it's an anomaly.
Yeah, and so essentially like now by getting alerted on that, I'm actually having a way to find areas of things like data exfiltration, right?
Well, and it's real. I mean, we've seen this, right, Patrick? We've seen Office 365. Someone had an account logged in from, Malaysia is, one that, sticks out in my head. And then the next thing they saw was 4,000 emails being sent out from that account. And, they got an alert from Microsoft a day later.
Yeah, we all know, like, in the COVID era and work from home, like yeah, the probability of someone logging in from Malaysia when you're a 100% US based company would be an example of something where it's like,
Yeah.
it just ain't gonna happen.
Well, I heard though, Hawaii will pay you to go there and work remotely from Hawaii now. So,
Oh, really?
that could
What is
be an
that?
option for
How much
some
they
people.
pay you?
Good question. I think it's the tourism, but I mean, yeah, there is no normal anymore, but there's still a semblance of what is an anomaly, and logging in from another country is probably an anomaly.
Like, it's like, we'll pay you to bring your Corona here. Oh man,
You
you
still
got
have
to
to
be a little
quarantine.
cynical nowadays. And then I think, I think the other aspect is that there's some aspect of continual monitoring. And I always, one of the things I joke about is the reality that it's like eyes on glass, like, is a person looking through a billion logs over a 24-hour period, which is realistic of some of the data volumes that we see at times from customers. It's like eyes in glass really ain't gonna be a good way to catch stuff, right?
It's definitely not scalable.
Yeah, it doesn't scale, and so, like, that's where having the right focused sets of rules and parameters that surface and alerts and detect, right, 24/7 automatically is really the most effective way to essentially solve and identify the majority of potential threats out there, right? um and so I think that's important. And then I think the other aspect is, like, if you're using a cloud-based solution for SIM, which most people are moving towards, making sure you have some sort of reliability plan from a internet connectivity perspective, whether it's logs getting queued up.
Yeah, you don't want to
um,
have a gap in logs just
uh,
because your ISP had a blip.
yep. So all important things. And then I think the last thing is in here is coverage, right? And I will say this, like, one of the things I really appreciate is, as a company early on, we've had some customers that maybe bought us, and we originally was like, oh, we're going to provide this service for you for your firewall.
Mhm.
um and that logic at the time is good, but most of people make these decisions based on cost. It's like, well, I feel like I can only afford it for this one capability, right? And just from an experience perspective firsthand, what I can tell you is usually that means you have a huge gap.
Yeah.
In whether that's cloud infrastructure, right? Like Azure, Office 365, the identity side, Windows hosts.
Yeah. There are so
Have
many indicators of something going wrong that aren't just on the firewall. I mean, it's
Well, and nowadays, right? It's like, well, who's actually going through the firewall, right?
yeah. I mean, it's almost like putting
Um,
a puzzle together with blinders on. It's you don't get a full picture of what's happening, and you just can't see what's happening in the big picture, right? It's hard to correlate events if you're only getting events from one thing.
yes, and I think that's what's really important here is, it's like, as you're looking at and assessing, hey, from a threat detection response perspective, what places should I have coverage with? Where like, and I call this, like, hey, this is really like the core to where you're going to find most things and detect them along the way. If you look at a staged attack, right? um if I'm looking at ransomware, ports open on the firewall and connectivity from a host could be detected on both the firewall as well as through Windows logs, and they might show up differently at different times depending on how those logs are parsed and what firewall you use. And so it's like, okay, there's two places I can find them. The VPN, oh wow, like, persistently someone's trying to log into an account. Brute force, password spraying, oh, that happens to be tied to Active Directory.
Yep.
Oh, I probably would want to make sure that's covered too, right? oh, hey, now someone's in my environment, or there's a Windows host and they run Bluekeep, or they run a Cobalt Strike or other things, right?
Yeah.
Windows host detection. And so you can kind of see here pretty quickly, it's like, if you have a good sense of the things listed here between firewall, endpoint, identity, your productivity suites, your cloud infrastructure with Azure, and your hosts, you're going to have a pretty damn good chance of actually catching someone or catching a real threat.
Yeah.
Is the reality there, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. If you walk through the processes that someone would take to, compromise your data, cause a breach, whatever your terminology you want to use is, right? You want to kind of walk through that and research that if you're not familiar with it. And the areas that they're trying to infiltrate or trying to get a land grab, the activities that they're trying to do, whether that's reaching out and downloading malware on a machine from an attachment that a user executed, or if it's data exfiltration, you want to look at how those events are processed, where they're logged, and what's happening. And that's where you want to have the coverage. And typically that includes, right, I mean, anything and everything you have on the screen. If you have a product that can log anything of good security value, you probably should be trying to include that in your logging stack.
Log all the things.
Log all the things that provide relevant security value.
I think that's important to know. Yeah, I think sometimes, it's kind of interesting. Customers are like, well, I want to send you all these logs. And it's like, well, those aren't really going to help you do much.
Yeah.
And I do think they're like, something that comes up from time to time is like Secops. Is that the right network traffic type of stuff, right? And I mean, time and time again, the reality is like, yes, things can be detected on the network. There's a few tools that do that effectively, but like that is not the most effective way to do threat detection response.
Yeah.
And nowadays, even more so because of things like cloud infrastructure and work from home, right?
I would rather get logs from a NAC, right, like ICE or Forescout, rather than trying to get logs from individual switches and essentially recreate what a NAC is doing.
Yep.
That's just me.
It's good. Good feedback. All right, cool. So I'm going to hop in and just talk a little bit about some of the area in which we've helped people with. Now, before I go there, though, if anybody has any questions or thoughts or ideas as far as, other things that should be looked at from a threat detection response perspective, I just want to open it up for, anybody on the call here to solicit your ideas or feedback if you have any. So I'll give it a few seconds there in regards to any thoughts of things that we seem to be missing or overlooking as we're talking about how to approach this, and hopefully this is helpful for everyone on the call. So I'm gonna wait. Come on, someone's got some ideas or questions or thoughts. Krisha, Kevin, Luke. Maybe not. I guess we're just super boring. Everyone's got that like afternoon lunch hangover.
Could be a Friday, webinar, and then
it's Thursday. Come on.
That's what I'm saying.
Maybe our Zoom is frozen. It's just me and you left. We're that bad, guys. Come on. A light crowd today as far as interaction. I mean, people are on, but they just, they ain't chatting. I even open it up so that everyone can see open questions in this webinar. So
that's a dangerous quest.
Yeah. I mean, we're trying to make it a little bit more fun this time. I should have brought that up earlier. So ask your questions, put some comments in. We're doing good. We're just listening. Thanks, Forrest. Make us feel good.
This is a little more lighthearted than typical webinars, if you can't tell.
Oh, I can't do serious webinars. Never. I mean,
I don't know if you've
never
ever read
see
off
me
a script in your life.
in a suit. Michigan, you know. Oh, we got a Q&A. If you were a hot dog, would you eat yourself? Dude, this has to be someone that knows I love hot dogs. I used to run Duo Hot Dog Day at Duo. I was going to start it at
Sure.
Blumira, and then there was a whole epidemic. So
Like your tactic was always where can I get the most hot dogs for the cheapest, and
I can
doesn't
feed
doesn't
100.
always pay off.
Hey, I can feed 100 people for under $150. So
I think yeah, I
that's one
mean
of
even
my.
half that I think is what you've done.
Yep. All right, Krisha, Active Directory and domain controllers are always a spot that gets targeted. Yeah, I mean, like, I think people are normally shocked once they have visibility into their AD logs and user account failed logins and things of that nature, like that they just have never seen before.
Yeah.
I think the main thing there is like, Active Directory, you can go to the event viewer and see some events, but to see like the correlation of number of failed attempts from a single user, for instance, with distinct counts, like those are really valuable pieces. So if I were a hot dog, I'd only eat myself though if it had mustard on it. So, in regards to security operations challenge on the Blumira side, where we spend a lot of our time is focusing on the fact that organizations have limited teams and resources. Companies can't afford dedicated large security teams or SOC, right? And a lot of times have limited expertise. So yeah, we see organizations with 2,500, 5,000 employees, and the CISO basically is doing everything related to security, and the help desk is who's backstopping them, right? And so when it comes to all the different products we talked about in security and all the alerts they kick off, and also the aspect of like, even if you have log centralization and some rules, usually when you have a SIM, it kicks off a ton of noise. And you're going to end up spending a ton of time trying to tweak and tune it, which is a real challenge, right? And so where we help with this is more or less helping to get the aspect of detection and response capabilities and filling in the gaps of kind of the things we showed, and being able to do that and deploying in a matter of hours. Usual POC takes a couple of hours to operationalize at almost any size environment, and eliminate a lot of the noise and helping people take action via playbook or automated response in that regard. And so, essentially how we're doing this is we're automating all the tasks manually that people would have to do of ingesting and parsing and correlating threat intelligence and defining detection rules, and helping get to a place where you can get to some level of automated detection and response. And then when it's not fully automated, providing a playbook on what someone can actually need, or what someone needs to do from an action perspective. So really cool. In regards to our product, Blumira, we also backstop that with access to product and security expertise. And we're able to do that more or less because of how simple we've made the product from a deployment, implementation, and operational perspective. And so, how this works is essentially we integrate with your existing tech stack. So a lot of things we talked about, from identity to firewall to cloud to endpoint, and automating on the front end. So once we connect up to things, we start surfacing threats. If it can be automated, help take action. If not, providing a playbook on what to do. And Jacob, I'm kind of curious from your perspective, like any stories you want to share here from a POC or customer perspective that you found incredibly valuable?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, right, for a typical deployment for us, it really is a matter of 2 or 3 meetings, right, each an hour a piece, until you're ingesting most of what is valuable to you in your environment. And then right at that point, we handle all of the hard, the boring, monotonous, heavy lifting of a SIM. Things like writing the parsing for different log types, and when you update your firewall, for a weekly patch, and insert vendor name here changes how that's sent. Do you want to be the one that updates the parsing on your SIM and figures out what changed and why it's not parsing? No, we handle that. Same thing from a rule and detection standpoint, right? All of that heavy lifting, the monotony of maintaining a typical SIM, we can handle on our end, so that you really, as the end user of the product, only have to worry about responding to the alerts that we surface. And we purposely make it so that the alerts that you see are timely and meaningful, and high indicators of something that you should investigate, not just somebody scanned our external IP on the firewall and I'm going to get an alert from my SIM for that, because that's extremely low value, happening 100 times a day. So
Yep.
that's how we do it, right? That's how we've made this attainable.
Yeah, and I got a great question on chat. Thus far, good presentation. It's covered a lot of areas we were looking at. On average, how long does this take to change from a sea of red in alerts to being able to find real threats? I'd say, surprisingly, our product works quite differently than your traditional SIM products. What people normally say is like, why am I not getting any alerts?
Yeah.
And so, maybe there's a little bit of tuning up front, working with customers, but the large majority are like, wait, why aren't we seeing anything? Like, it's been a day, it's been 24 hours. And it's like, because truthfully, we're focused on surfacing real risk and threats, and not just things that you should go look at and might or might not be. And that's the problem with this space, and why so many people fail. I mean, 75% of SIMs fail in that regard. And so reality is like, we were just on call this morning, in half an hour, a full hour call, we had firewall logs from Cisco ASA and FTD ingested. We had Windows domain controllers ingested. We had Umbrella ingested, and Meraki. And essentially, it's like, we're in a good enough place to actually start detecting real things, and we kick on the rules, right? And yeah, we'll expand coverage with other Windows hosts, right? And maybe add additional things as the customer has them. But yeah, the real reality is like, it doesn't take much more of an hour or two of the customer's time to realize this, without having to spend all the time of tweaking and tuning SIM. And a lot of that has to be related to like, not trying to detect things that are, relatively speaking, high false positive, very low risk,
benign.
Benign.
Yeah. We don't want to send alerts out just for the sake of sending alerts and trying to make it seem like something's happening. The reality is, in most environments, thankfully, right, you're not actively being exploited or breached daily. So it's a good thing to not see alerts from Blumira.
Yeah, and I tell people, like, almost all of our customers, I'd say 90% of them deploy the product and get like almost fully operational before they even buy. Like, our main thing is like, yeah, don't trust our word for it. Like, try it, because it actually does work. And most people end up buying because it does. I'd say when they don't buy, they're like, yeah, I didn't have any money. I'm not the real decision maker, but that's our bad on the sales side for not qualifying that stuff out. But no, more or less, it's like, yeah, try it, take it for a ride. We allow people to do that for a reason. What's shocking more and more is like, we're getting pulled up into large enterprise customers that have high sophistication, have these tool sets, but the reality is, there's so much noise. They're like, oh man, we're going to use your product to be installed on Windows Active Directory just to kick us off the important stuff that matters out of that, because like, we can't prioritize the things that are important with all the stuff we get from our existing solutions. So talking about threats, a lot of different examples of things we detect: password spraying, brute force, geo impossible logins. Like, a lot of stuff can also get categorized into kind of like UEBA type stuff. If that might be a yucky word for some people, means a lot of different things. Ransomware, or things like privilege escalation, account creation for admins, common misconfigurations with SMB and RDP, exploits being run on Windows hosts. And I would say, like, by far, I tell everyone, it's like, our strength is definitely with your cloud infrastructure, cloud security, and Windows. And then, oh, someone wants to see a demo. Let me show that. Sorry, I get so excited about talking about this stuff, and then I didn't even show it. And so, yeah, they want to see what a detection actually looks like from a product perspective with Blumira. So I'm going to log into it, and there we go. Cancel. That's kind of funny. I accidentally hit the deny button, and it was like, this was an error, or I've been hacked. Is the answer.
One extreme or the other. Yeah.
Yeah, man. Like, whoa.
Nothing in between.
Yeah. To show an example, right, from a detection perspective. So, a few different things like Active Directory or G Suite is kind of the same, like administrative account creation. Why is this important? You want to validate when an administrator account is created, because if it wasn't created intentionally, like someone owns your environment and you want to remediate and take care of that fast. So in this case, I could mark, hey, the source user is unaware of why this was created. It's going to shut down, close out the suspected threat, and it's going to open up a new ticket that's a threat ticket. And that has to do with like notification and management of who's owning it. So that would send voice, text, or email based on how you're configured to notify people. And then if I go back in here, what you're going to see is now this is a rogue domain account administrator. So we're providing the PowerShell script on what to do from an take action perspective to disable that account, for instance. You can also interact with our analyst team via this chat. So that's, some of the people function of like, oh, hey, I keep on getting this alert and it's false positive. Well, just tell us and we'll change it. In some instances where there is a high possibility of false positive, we have a mark here that says, hey, this is a false positive, so we learn. And then, some of the other examples when we're talking about automated and things like firewall actions, I'm gonna scroll down here, and I'm totally laughing because I told everyone not to select the automated action button in our demo account because it hides the automated action. So I'll show a different one. But someone obviously did that because the ones I think I wanted to show.
Do the
I guess here's
scanning.
one. Yeah. What this is like, this could be password spraying, this could be recon scanning. So we have analysis here, and then we have matched evidence, and we stack this so that we don't open a ton of tickets, limit the noise. And in this instance, I can immediately block using any next-gen firewall. So Palo Alto, Cisco, Fortinet, or Checkpoint. I'm going to resolve the finding, and we're going to see here it then entered the IP addresses here, which works with your dynamic block lists. You insert this, and if I look at the configuration, I can take a step further and actually automate action, so I wouldn't even have to do that. So it could do it while I'm sleeping at night, and I don't have to deal with it or know about it. And then we do have the capability on the dynamic block list where we correlate threat feeds. So hey, high likelihood, low of false positives. Or you can go high and say like, hey, I just want to limit my risk. There might be a false positive or two in there from a threat feed perspective. But this is a form of basically automated blocking, correlating threat intelligence from I think it's like 14 or 15 different vendors, like Cisco, Talos, Alien Vaults List, and a bunch of other ones.
There's a bunch.
So pretty cool stuff. And then the setup perspective, the sensor, right now, this is a requirement, the Ubuntu sensor. Once you have it up and running, you can add modules. So when we're talking about quick to deploy, hey, Checkpoint, throw your API keys in, Umbrella, throw them in. Also, I can spin a honeypot up on this using Open Canary, and I just hit the install button, and now I'm detecting lateral movement. So when we're talking about getting the ingestion and detection with limited noise, the reality is we're really able to do this in a matter of hours, if that's helpful. So does it also have automated application of firewall rules for Cisco? Cisco Meraki doesn't support it. So you should tell your Cisco Meraki friends that they should support dynamic block lists, and we'll tell our friends too there. But yeah, the Merakis, you can get visibility and do threat detection. The automated portion, it doesn't support dynamic block lists. The FTDs and the ASAs do though, but we know you probably like Meraki more. Oh, that's the reality from our experience. So hopefully that's helpful, Chase. And either Patrick or Chase, if you want to hit us up, we're happy to hop on more time with you, run you through the product and have you try it yourself. It doesn't take long, and POCs a lot of times, what I would say is we surface real stuff that, generally speaking, people are pretty surprised about or see a different perspective they haven't seen before. So, oh, we have a demo scheduled. Oh, we're gonna have fun then. Cool. Well, hey, thanks for everybody. It's 2:00. Really appreciate everyone making time to hang out with me and Jacob today. Talk about threat detection response, how to assess it, and then more or less, in addition to that, how Blumira helps address those needs really quickly and effectively. So thanks so much. Any last words, Jacob, before we hop off?
No, I think you covered everything, Patrick. I would just say, if you're interested in learning more, feel free to contact us. It's so easy to get this up and running. You got nothing to lose.
Oh, and I forgot, next week I get to hang out with Megan Orlando, senior pen tester at Networks Group, and we're going to talk about top remote work exploits of 2020.
Oh man,
whatever that means. Yeah, I'm kidding. It should
that'll
be
be
fun.
interesting.
Yeah, you can hop on too if you want to hang out with us. It's cool. And Alicia, first or second week on the job. Thanks for kicking us off today.
My pleasure.
All right. Take
Thank
care.
you all.